This is the Voluntarian podcast with your host Abe Collier, based in Odesa, Ukraine. Here we discuss humanitarian aid, working in an international context, and volunteering. This podcast is a production of Dignity Aid International. Your donations can help us provide humanitarian assistance in this conflict. Please find a link in the description or comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Now, on to the podcast. Welcome, everyone, to the first episode of the Voluntarian podcast. This is a podcast based in Odesa, Ukraine, to raise money for humanitarian aid and share the stories of humanitarian work here in Ukraine. I'm here today with Chris Hennemeyer, a volunteer in the humanitarian field here, who we've met at the beginning of this last year, I believe.
Right.
Chris grew up all around the world. His dad was in the Foreign Service, in Tanzania, in Gambia, all over Europe. Went to the University of Maryland and went to the Peace Corps in Ghana. I have my notes here. Then worked as a journalist for a little while. Tried to work as a journalist in the U.S. before being stationed in Africa once again, with first in Burundi, I believe.
That's right. With
Catholic Relief Services in the international humanitarian aid field. And from there, you've been all over the world. Liberia and Rwanda and Macedonia and all the rest. And then you retired recently and have come back as a humanitarian volunteer in Ukraine. So What did I miss there in your intro?
Well, I guess the question is why Ukraine? Because there's no shortage of humanitarian crises that I could have jumped into.
Absolutely.
But as you said, I retired and I intended to stick with my retirement. But because I'd worked in Ukraine in 2015 and I had an affinity for the place. I've been based in Kharkiv. I really liked the people I worked with. I kept thinking about Ukraine every time I would turn my laptop on and watch some horrifying story coming out of this country. But I knew my girlfriend would not be thrilled if I announced that I was jumping on a plane and getting back to work. So I just let the horrifying stories wash over me for about 6 months until finally one day she walked into the living room, saw me there watching another Ukraine story and said, "You really should go there and do something." And so having that green light, I got a ticket, came here in January, as you said, and spent 3 months, left in April, went back to the States, popped around, did things that retired people do, and then decided to come back for another 3 months at the end of this year. So it's a change of pace. It's a relief to be a volunteer rather than a paid humanitarian professional, and we'll get into some of the reasons why I prefer that. But yeah, it's great to be back here.
If I remember correctly, you came to Odesa with the idea of working with one of the bigger INGOs, the international non-governmental organizations, but you ended up working with one of the smaller ones, right?
That's right. And my goal was always to work for a local NGO, but I had a little difficulty getting connected during my first couple of weeks in country. And a friend of mine was working for a large international NGO. And he said, "No problem, we can put you on as a volunteer." And it was very kind of him to do so. But it didn't take very long for me to realize that all the things that I had experienced, both good and bad, in the international NGO career were pretty much the same no matter where you went. And at this stage of my life, I wasn't particularly interested in a heavily bureaucratic, well-heeled international organization. I didn't feel like the value that I would add would be particularly significant. Whereas there are, as you know, a number of very committed, very passionate, very well-intentioned and well-informed Ukrainian NGOs, and they just need a little help, help deciphering, navigating the strange international humanitarian world we operate in, and connecting them with donors and funders and supporters, and making sense of the systems that are in place. And so that's what I've been doing since I got here, and it seems to be useful.
So how would you describe the difference between your role as a full-time humanitarian worker and executive for many years and what you do as a volunteer now? And why do you suggested you might prefer being a volunteer?
Oh, I absolutely prefer it. And I have the luxury of preferring it because as a retired person, I've got a little bit of income and I have a pension and so on, so I don't have to worry so much about money. But what I'm doing today feels so much more like what I did at the start of my humanitarian career, where I wasn't swamped in paperwork. I didn't spend hours on end on Zoom calls. I wasn't continually being asked for compliance reports or to undergo online trainings and so on. I actually get to periodically go out and get my boots dirty and see the people that we intend to help. And
That's right. You were down in Kherson recently.
I
Just
was
a few miles from the front lines.
yeah, bit in. Hang on, let me just cut that for a second. I have been near the front lines. Where I was the other day was not particularly close to the front lines. It was in northern Kherson province, but it was an area that had been occupied by the Russians.
Destroyed buildings and all of that.
Lots of destroyed buildings. The brand new school that the community had refurbished and filled with shiny new computers had been gutted. Of course, all the computers have been thrown in the back of a Russian truck and taken back to Russia. The story of so many little villages in this country. But as I was saying, I mean, I feel like what I'm doing today is similar to what I was doing 40 years ago. Very basic humanitarian work without all the multiple levels of bureaucracy and sort of pointless bureaucracy that has overtaken the field in the intervening 4 decades. So that's why I enjoy it.
So you seem to be suggesting that the international humanitarian system has changed quite a bit. Not only your role within it, but the whole system, maybe more bureaucratization, more complexity. If that's the case and you agree, why do you think that might have been, or what are some of the reasons?
Well, I think there are a lot of reasons. I mean, people will point to the fact that there are more and larger conflicts going on today than there were 40 or 50 years ago. That's not to say that we didn't have intractable and widespread conflicts a couple of generations ago. There are larger numbers of displaced persons and refugees than there have traditionally been. But there's also a call for humanitarian agencies to intervene to a degree that was never the case half a century ago or a century ago. I mean, people died and starved and in obscurity for long periods of human history. In an era where everybody has a camera and information and images flow freely, that's not something that the world community will stand for. So they built this enormously cumbersome apparatus with a lot of money flowing through it and with a lot of levels of control that delivers a lot of aid to a lot of people in need and certainly saves lives and restores livelihoods, but it does so in a very inefficient and ineffective way. It's slow, it's cumbersome, it often misses the point. And it's, I think we've talked about this. It's a sector that's just aching to be disrupted in very fundamental ways. And it doesn't seem to be happening. And it's unclear to me why it's not happening. But I sense that it can't continue this way. Even people who were senior United Nations officials and have moved on to other things have spoken out about how the current humanitarian system is in many ways broken.
I want to get back to that disruption point. But just to touch on this, when you say the international humanitarian system is primarily composed right now of a constellation of UN agencies or UN-affiliated agencies, and then some big national agencies that work directly with them, like USAID, Norwegian Refugee Council, IsraAid, etc. Would you say that's the main international players in the field?
Yeah, I mean, the international humanitarian sector is largely funded by Western countries. Not exclusively, and that's changing a bit. We can touch on that later. But it's largely funded by big donors in the West. The United States happens to be one of the largest contributors, even per capita, as does the UK, as do the Nordic states. and many others. That money flows to UN institutions and it flows to international non-governmental organizations.
Like the Red Cross.
Like the Red Cross, which gets massive amounts of money from the government of Switzerland and other governments, like Save the Children, like Catholic Relief Services, like CARE, like Mercy Corps, and so on. And many of those organizations also have their own fundraising arms. So they are, in some cases, largely dependent upon the bilateral aid that we're talking about that comes from the US or the UK or elsewhere. But they also depend upon donations from individuals, and those can mount up significantly. I mean, I was looking at some figures for World Vision, big Protestant evangelical humanitarian organization, does humanitarian and development work, and we'll get into the distinction between those two. But World Vision's annual budget is over $3 billion a year, and I couldn't tell you exactly what percentage of that is public money coming from governments and how much is, $20 checks from grandma and so on. But a big chunk of it is private individuals handing in money at church and so on. So, $1 billion in private donations, that would have been unheard of in the past. But now it's quite common. So with huge amounts of money, of course, come lots of rules and regulations. And that's, all well and good. But at times it seems that the tail is wagging the dog, that there's so much emphasis on complying with auditing and accounting regulations that it impedes the field from carrying out its work in an agile and speedy way. And that's what you need in an emergency.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's move to disruption then.
Yeah.
Who do you see doing disruption, if anyone, and where do you see more potential for that?
Well, I mean, there are ideas that have been floating around that that the authors of which claimed would dramatically disrupt the humanitarian sector. For example, there's been a lot of talk in the last few years about AI being used as a tool to analyze the immense amounts of data that are collected by humanitarian organizations and using those data to predict future catastrophes and crises. As far as I can tell, this remains largely a fantasy. I don't think it's being done in any serious way by anybody. There was an infatuation 10 years ago with models that Silicon Valley was promoting. And the then head of USAID, Raj Shah, was a big believer. He'd come out of the tech world, and he thought if we could just put enough apps in enough hands, we could measure everything, and we could communicate information quickly, and this would inevitably result in better work. It didn't. So what might come up next? I mean, I think a lot of people have been waiting for private donors in the private sector to kind of shake things up, to take it out of the hands of governments and multilateral organizations like the UN that are inevitably going to be top-heavy and slow. And there are some good examples of that happening, but it hasn't yet reached a tipping point where it really changes the culture. And that's what you need to change. You need to change the entire culture of the humanitarian sector. There's a guy we've talked about who runs an organization called MOAS.
Yes.
And MOAS began basically as a ship cruising around the Mediterranean, picking up refugees from North Africa that were trying to make their way to Europe and found themselves stranded in little boats here and there and taking them to safety. And they did that very successfully for several years. And then they've started up an operation here in Ukraine that runs ambulances up to the front lines and evacuates people who've been wounded either in fighting or who are severely ill and takes them to medical centers here and there. They're very successful, and they do it all with private money. The founder of the organization is a wealthy guy himself, runs an insurance company. He has a lot of wealthy friends. They've all chipped in. Got a fleet of 52 ambulances, and they're doing it their own way. They're doing it with a minimum of paperwork and with a maximum of results. That's That's conceivable if you have large amounts of private money. It's inconceivable given the current structure of traditional aid donors. Yeah.
So, one of the things, from my perception, which seems to drive some of the bureaucracy and complexity in these organizations is a desire for neutrality and an insistence on neutrality. There's been a lot of talk with the Ukraine conflict. Obviously, there's a pretty clear aggressor and a pretty clear, country that's under occupation or partially under occupation, and how neutrality principles don't exactly apply or should apply. A lot of conversation about that. Tell us just some thoughts on neutrality, where you stand on that as a humanitarian principle, and maybe how it holds the field back or helps the field push forward.
Yeah, so you've said it very well. I mean, there are a series of humanitarian principles. Generally speaking, there are 4 core principles. Some organizations have as many as 7. And neutrality is one of them. And a lot of this comes out of the history of the humanitarian field. And so if we were to go back to this part of the world, actually, to Crimea in 1853, the Crimean War was being waged. And this is where the Red Cross and the Swiss version of it first came into being. And as Switzerland has sort of made a fetish of neutrality, and to their great benefit in many ways, so the International Red Cross, which is headquartered in Geneva, also treats neutrality with great seriousness. And that principle has been adopted by pretty much every international organization working in the humanitarian space. When I say adopted, what I mean by that is everybody has a handbook that says it's a very important principle, must be respected. In reality, humans are not neutral beings. We have favorites, we have preferences, and nowhere is it clearer than a place like Ukraine, where neutrality, speaking about neutrality to our Ukrainian colleagues, would get little more than a few raised eyebrows and rolled eyes. They clearly and rightfully, I think, see Russia as the aggressor and see no reason why neutrality is useful to them. Now, there are places and times and instances where neutrality is super useful. I mean, if you want to send a delegation from the Red Cross in Geneva to Russia to help free Ukrainian prisoners of war, you better be perceived as being neutral. Otherwise, the Russians will not speak to you. If you want to retrieve Ukrainian children who have been taken to Russia, likewise, you have to at least adopt the language of neutrality. But by and large, it's sort of a pointless concept in this particular conflict. Now, this is a pretty cut and dried conflict, and they're not all like that. I mean, there are lots of really complicated conflicts with multiple aggressors where nobody's clean. Not to say that everybody's clean in this conflict either. Bad things happen, of course, but this is a much more black and white one than most that I've been involved in. If I think back on the Congo Wars or the wars in Liberia, or it's difficult to point to good guys and bad guys, just different gradations of bad guys.
So, and from a practical standpoint then, what would it look like for an international NGO or an international actor to sort of deprioritize neutrality? Would that be like funding local NGOs who are explicitly patriotic? Would it mean refusing to work with one military over the other, or allowing work with one military, not the other? Why push the boundaries of neutrality? And from a practical standpoint, what gains can be made?
I'm not sure there are a lot of gains in this particular instance in Ukraine, to be honest. It's not as if humanitarian organizations are doing cross-border work running between Ukraine and Russia, helping people on both sides of the lines. There are organizations obviously working in Russia, mainly Russian organizations, but not exclusively. They're helping people on those sides of the lines, but the needs are almost entirely on the Ukrainian side of the lines. So the neutrality that allows you to freely move from one side of a conflict line to the other is really not an issue here today. I suppose there are some very specific instances where foregoing neutrality would be useful. For example, if you're running an ambulance service to the front lines and you wish to uh, you wish to evacuate wounded soldiers, as I understand, the Geneva Convention allows you to do so. Soldiers are not to be treated any differently from any other injured or wounded person in wartime. But it's very difficult for donors to get their minds around the notion of an organization which they have funded using those monies to essentially assist the armed forces of another country by evacuating their people.
Especially if the money's coming from the UN, where Russia has a seat on the UN Security Council and can shut that down pretty fast, I suppose.
Absolutely. So, yeah, I think there are a handful of cases where saying we're going to forego neutrality would be a useful thing. But practically speaking, the implications are marginal in a place like this.
Yeah, I've always felt it to be a good principle in theory.
Yeah.
But maybe, provide some area for improvement, for flexibility.
I've certainly worked in places where, it was very helpful to be perceived as neutral. I mean, operating in Rwanda during the genocide/civil war, and moving from one side, who were clearly the perpetrators of the genocide, to the other side, which were clearly the victims of the genocide. If I were perceived as neutral, and I was, and the organization I worked for was, I could move about with great freedom and had a lot of ability to do things that would have been impossible if I'd been seen as non-neutral. But that's not always the case.
That reminds me, actually, I'd like to go back to your career a bit more there, because we talk about Rwanda. You've been some cool places. Does anywhere, are there any places that remind you of this current conflict in Ukraine, perhaps, that you draw from in particular in your work here in Ukraine?
Well, I have been to some cool places, although Rwanda at that time was not a particularly cool place. It was a horrible place. And so were many of them. I mean, Sierra Leone was awful. Liberia was awful. One place that I worked in fairly recently, I guess this was 2 years ago, that reminds me a bit of Ukraine in that, and this is my personal opinion, obviously, and there are people that would take great exception to what I'm about to say, in that there was, to my eyes, a clear aggressor and a clear victim was northern Ethiopia in Tigray province, where for a variety of complicated reasons, war broke out between the Ethiopian Federation and the province of Tigray in northern Ethiopia. And the Tigrayan people and their land were laid to waste by Ethiopian troops and their allies from Eritrea. And that was a very clear case of a war on civilians, much as Ukraine is a war on civilians. Every night, as you know, because we live in this town, we hear, not every night, but every couple of nights, we hear missiles and drones coming in. And by and large, they're hitting civilians as often as they're hitting infrastructure. Very few soldiers are dying here because of missile attacks and drone attacks. They're ordinary Ukrainians. And that was the case in Tigray. So that was another place where I felt like neutrality was a bit of an empty phrase.
All right, Chris, back from a bit of a break. Let's talk a bit about localization. We've been touching on it here and there. There have been a lot of commitments made by the international humanitarian community in various summits that they're going to focus on localization, push more of the money out of these big organizations and into small local actors. What do you think of that idea, and how do you think it's going?
Well, I don't know anybody that works in this field that doesn't think it's a good idea. I mean, it doesn't require a genius to know that local organizations understand the atmosphere, the environment, the problems, the needs far better than international organizations. They're closer to the grassroots. They speak the language, and in a place like Ukraine and many other countries, there's plenty of technical capacity. They're people that understand how to do construction and health and livelihoods and so on. So from that perspective, localization is the way to go. But unfortunately, even though it's been sort of the favorite flavor of the donors for the last several years, actually close to probably 12, 13 years now, it's making very slow progress if you measure the percentage of aid dollars that are funneled through international organizations versus local organizations.
Less than 5%, I heard, going to local.
Well, I don't know what it is worldwide. I think maybe in this country, I think it probably is close to 5%. I think, if they hit 15%, it's a big deal worldwide. But the targets are always higher than that. So the big donors, USAID and DFID and so on in the UK, consistently miss their targets. And one of the reasons they missed them is because although they claim to want to put the money through local organizations, they are averse to the risks that are inherent in funding those organizations. And this is the big contradiction of humanitarian donors. They work in these super high-risk places where very little is predictable, where banking systems sometimes don't function, where personal security is not guaranteed, where political and military situations can change overnight, but they are highly, highly risk-averse, as large elephantine organizations tend to be. So they, as a result, try and impose upon local organizations the kinds of heavy, rigid, inflexible, difficult compliance measures that they impose upon international organizations. I've worked many times for organizations that are giving small grants to a local organization. And when I say small, $10,000, $20,000. And they make them sign contracts that can be as long as 70 pages, full of legalese that, American lawyers couldn't make sense of, let alone somebody running a small local charity or humanitarian.
In a second language.
In a second language. So it's insane. Everybody recognizes it's insane. And as a result, the rich get richer, and what I mean by that is the big international NGOs continue to get the lion's share of the wealth, and those organizations, the local ones that are in a better position to do things, don't get much. And when they do, the strings that come attached to them are so painful. I was talking to a woman who heads up a local NGO this morning, a Ukrainian NGO here in Odesa, and she said, what was her phrase? They're taking the love out of the work that we do. They do this out of a passion and a commitment and a genuine love for what they're doing, and then the imposition of these impossible operational, managerial, and financial requirements just rob it of the love. Now, look, we know that many places where humanitarian organizations work are also places that are fundamentally corrupt, and Ukraine's one of them. So, of course, you need to have some sort of accountability and some tracking mechanisms in place. But what they're putting in place goes far beyond what any rational person would require. So, yeah, unless and until they decide to take a few risks, lose a little bit of money here and there for the greater good, things won't change.
One of the problems I see there is exactly with the bureaucratic requirements, even the minimal ones that you and I might agree are necessary. You need a full-time staff, and you need, an accountant and a lawyer and a couple of people to manage the papers.
Yeah.
A lot of these local organizations are almost entirely volunteer run.
Yep.
And the international grants, even from the largest organizations, tend to ask for, let's say, less than 20% of money spent on staff, often less than 10%, whereas the international organizations are spending sometimes 50% or 40% on staff. And so just the imbalance there makes it really hard for the local orgs. Do you think that's one of the
huge
problems?
problem, massive problem. Yeah, it's there are even donors that will say, "Look, we would be happy to fund the purchase of medical equipment, um, but we don't want to pay for any overhead." Now, what organization in the world can function without overhead, without some staff? Yeah, no, this is a huge problem, and some NGOs, some local NGOs have tried to push back by first, obviously, building in staff time to manage their projects, but also building in a tiny percentage that can become part of their rainy day fund, kind of keep things moving in between those periods when grants are available. But this is also, the living from project to project, living from grant to grant is a little bit the curse of the model that we've set up. And it's as much a curse on international organizations as it is national. And as a result, massive amounts of time are spent chasing the next chunk of money.
Yeah.
Fundraising becomes an end unto itself, and less attention is paid to the quality of delivery of services to people in humanitarian humanitarian crises. I mean, if you sit in a boardroom of any large international organization, and they talk about their results, they will inevitably trumpet the $70 million grant they received or the $100 million contract they signed, as if measuring things in dollars is really a smart way of determining whether you're doing good or not. It's the dumbest possible way.
So you mentioned, speaking of that, taking the love out of the work that we do.
Yeah.
This is something we wanted to discuss, and I'd like to get back to. What is humanitarian aid? What differentiates it from, I don't know, a food bank or something like that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, everybody probably has their own definition of this, but I think when I talk about humanitarian aid, I'm talking about the kind of aid that's necessary in the very short term to meet very basic, essential human needs. Food, shelter, and medical care. Anything beyond that moves into the realm of sort of transitional aid or ultimately development aid. And these things are, of course, all connected. And, good development planning will hopefully mitigate the need for humanitarian aid later down the road. But the problem is knowing what stage you're in and being agile enough to provide what's needed in that particular situation. Again, I hearken back to a meeting I had recently with a local NGO that said, our donor is pushing us to take more emergency hygiene kits and pump them into communities because they have hundreds of thousands of these kits in their pipeline and they want to move them. But that's not the fundamental need out there right now. In Ukraine, where we're sitting now, nobody's dying because they don't have toilet paper or hand sanitizer. The basic needs of Ukrainians are generally met. And so, they should be thinking much more seriously about the medium-term needs. We're approaching winter in a couple of months. Let's get houses winterized. Let's get buildings repaired, and that will happen. But it will happen much more slowly than it should. Yeah, another example I can think of is when I was here earlier this year. There were a lot of communities whose water systems had been damaged by the fighting, by Russian shelling and so on. So pipes were blown up, little water towers were destroyed. Humanitarian organizations responded by and large by trucking tens of thousands of bottles of water out to these places at great expense. Now, that's fine. You need to get people water immediately as they need it. But rarely was the money available to repair the infrastructure that had been damaged or to put in place a new borehole or a new well for people that would solve the problem long term, because donors see that as a non-emergency need. Emergency is a bunch of plastic water bottles. Whereas clearly there's, the link is obvious, and putting the money that had been spent on delivering these massive trucks of water to every corner of Ukraine would have been much better spent in repairing infrastructure. But
So how do you make that transition? So maybe two questions contained in there. Is it the role of the international humanitarian organizations to do development, transitional and development aid after the initial emergency humanitarian aid? Or is it the role of private sector or of governments? Or should they, what balance do you see there as more ideal than what we have right now?
Well, it's all of the above. And in a place like Ukraine, I mean, you do have a fairly robust private sector, but that private sector is going to invest in large cities. That money is not going to go out to the thousands of little tiny villages that still exist in this country that are kind of relics of of Ukraine in the Soviet era and are often populated by elderly people, disabled people, people living on pensions, and so on. Those people need help, but they're never going to benefit from a Western investor coming to their village. Government will have its role, and Ukraine has a large and complex government. It has systems in place, but it's a super bureaucratic government. And as any reading of a newspaper article about this country will abundantly display, it's also a pretty corrupt government. So there will continue to be a role for local NGOs and international NGOs in delivering that kind of assistance to people. And I think, it's the end is not in sight. And it's going to go on for a long time. But the funding will diminish, once the war is over, for certain. I mean, we've been through this before in many countries, including Ukraine. I mean, the 2014-2015 war with Russia brought in a fair amount of money, but many of those donors and many of those organizations packed up their suitcases and left once the war had kind of simmered down and the lines had hardened. And I think that was a missed opportunity because there's so much that could be done in this country. The many organizations that were stood up in the 14-15 war and the current war should be playing a role in the future post-humanitarian crisis in dealing with all kinds of issues: civic advocacy, anti-corruption work, women's empowerment. All of these things are natural areas for those organizations to be involved in, as long as they can bring in some financial support.
So that would be down the road things like grants for small businesses, training for women entrepreneurs, things that would, civil society spaces to share.
100%. I mean, there are going to be people that are going to also need physical and emotional care for years to come as a result of this war. Rape victims, people who've lost limbs and eyes and so on. And a lot of that work is being done currently by nonprofits in this country, and hopefully they will receive their support. And that support, will come to some degree from external friends of Ukraine's, but it should also come from Ukrainians. I mean, there's a lot of money floating around this country. In this town where we sit, there are lots of wealthy people, some of whom are quite generous, and some of whom are not generous at all. And so what can Ukraine as a society and as a government do to put in place incentives for their own people to make contributions to their own recovery? Tax laws could be adjusted. Yeah,
that's one of the things I really like about working in Ukraine is I feel like there's a lot of capability here for Ukraine to teach Western organizations how to work better. I think the exchange goes both ways for sure, but I think there's a lot that Ukraine could teach Western organizations as we strive to do more partnering, hopefully at the local level.
Tremendously capable people in Ukraine. And many places I've worked. I mean, they're tremendously capable Nigerians and Nepalese and Congolese and so on. But Ukraine has the benefit of having at least a functional government and a culture that doesn't dissuade people from being smart, dynamic, entrepreneurial, which is sadly too often the case in sub-Saharan Africa, for example.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, let's move a bit to a more personal issue, maybe. Your motivation for doing humanitarian aid. What moved you and inspired you to get into it and to stay in it despite the psychological stresses and other stresses that may have come with the job over the years?
Well, I think it's probably a combination of the narcissistic and the idealist. I won't lie. I enjoy being in the thick of things, and particularly when there's a great moment in history going on. And this is a great moment in history here in Ukraine. And to sit on the sidelines at a time like this just didn't seem conceivable to me. I've encountered some of the most interesting, selfless, fascinating people in this field. And I can't imagine I would have had the same experience if I'd gone into banking or software or, and you have too. You're one of those people.
Yeah, for sure.
So those are all things that draw me back to this field, even in my retirement years. I feel like in the last 10 years of my professional career, a lot of that love and affection I had for the sector dissipated simply because, as is, I think, always the case, no matter what your profession is, the further you get away from that thing that attracted you to the endeavor in the first place, the less interesting your work becomes. As you climb the ladder, you get away from the things that you loved about it. But now I've managed to climb down the ladder rather than up it, and that's makes it a lot more fun. I just wish there was a way people could do this more frequently without having to reach retirement age, where at least their basic financial needs could be met, because there's an outpouring of goodwill towards this country, and a lot of skilled people, I think, who would be ready to jump in and share their time and muscle power and so on. And let's face it, this is not a hard place to work in many ways. I mean, if you and I got on a plane and tried to go to rural Somalia, we might be in for a bit of a shock. In fact, we probably wouldn't be allowed in as a couple of individuals unaffiliated with a big organization. But Ukraine the door is open to us. So let's take advantage of that opportunity.
Yeah, I think it's a new model maybe that's coming to the fore more and more, that people will take several months off and go and volunteer. It would really be great, as you say, to see more money available for those people to pay some basic living expenses, so more students could do it, or young parents, maybe not young parents, but whoever it may be,
Yeah, if you could do it in a way that was low on bureaucracy, create a kind of volunteer core of people that, could donate a few months or even a year of their lives and not have to worry about eating a meal 3 times a day and having a roof over their heads. So,
Speaking of working on the ground, local organizations here in southern Ukraine, you don't need to name drop. You're welcome to name drop. But what are some of the organizations you've worked with? What are they doing? What do you like? What do you not like about some of the specific experiences you've had?
Well, I've now worked for 2 relatively intensively. One called Manifest Mira, who you know very well, and the other called New Dawn, also very familiar to you. Great organizations doing really, really good work. And these are organizations that I respect a lot because they're doing it their own way. They've so far successfully managed to avoid becoming simply conduits for large international NGOs or UN agencies. They've tasted that Kool-Aid. They've found it lacking in many regards, but they've continued to do their work. There's a level of commitment by those people. They're all from Odesa region. They know the southern part of Ukraine. They've got contacts all over. They've got sources of information that international organizations can't even dream of. And they work really hard for really little compensation. So I have a huge amount of respect for them, and I'm certain that they are reflective of NGOs all over this country that are doing similar work. I just wish they could, as a community, speak out boldly and unambiguously to their friends in the international world and explain to them how they could best support humanitarian and development aid in Ukraine, because the way it's being done now is far from the best. But, as is often the case, people are loath to bite the hand that at least sometimes feeds them.
Yeah, that's fair. I've often thought if we could get more coordination, and there's very little coordination to some degree at the international level, but at the local level, the new organizations, lots of reasons, non-paid staff. But if you could get more coordination, have them asking for grants in consortiums of several organizations, you'd get a lot of advantages from having more linkages at the local level.
Yep. Let's keep pushing it.
Yeah, for sure. Let's zoom out a bit.
Okay.
A couple questions about the global work. One, you mentioned to me as we were talking before about what I've noted here as the internationalization of humanitarian aid. Maybe talk a little bit more about that, moving away from the West-dominated model.
Yeah, so humanitarian assistance is a product of Western culture. And I'm sure there are books out there that would explain how the Judeo-Christian culture gave rise to this. Certainly there's the origins of the Red Cross lie in a certain Western perspective. But that doesn't mean that other parts of the world don't care about humanitarian crises and aren't interested in being a part of it. But it has largely been monopolized by Western countries. The U.S. continues to be a massive donor. The European Union countries, by and large, although there's some very stingy European Union countries when it comes to humanitarian assistance. But the big up-and-coming economies, the BRICS plus, because BRICS are now talking about expanding by another 23 countries, I think it is. So, this is a prospective rival to Western economic and potentially political clout. The BRICS I think have 40% of the world's total population and at least a third of its economic wealth, and that will grow. And good. But if they want to be taken seriously, they have to be more than just manufacturers and sellers of goods and services. They have to have something more to bring to the table. It's a form of soft power, but it's also a form of idealism that gains you respect. And so it would be great to see the Indians and the Chinese doing much, much more. South Koreans, that's a booming economy. South Korea is considered one of the stingiest countries in the world when it comes to contributing to international aid. The Turks are another up-and-comer. They're doing a better job than they have in the past. I think every year Turkish aid budget grows by 2 or 3 times. So, and like any country, there are political drivers for this, but it's not just about promoting one's political influence. It's also about being seen as caring for people who don't necessarily look, think, or pray like us. Um, so, yeah, I would like to see a lot more of that. The international NGO world is almost entirely North American or Western European. There are a handful of exceptions. PIN, for example, People in Need is, where's PIN from? Poland? They've become a bit of a player of late. The Japanese have 1 or 2 NGOs that, are respectable, although not large. But I'm looking for the day when, a huge Chinese NGO rolls into town and starts doing things better and differently than the Western NGOs. I don't think that day's coming anytime soon, but I would love to see it.
Same.
There are. I've been in places in Africa where I think it's Grameen Bank from India has been in place, trying to do some good and bringing some of the lessons they've drawn from a not dissimilar environment to Africa. I think that's part of the future is expanding that contribution, because ultimately these humanitarian crises that we're talking about are shared crises. Climate change is affecting people all over this globe. Refugees are moving everywhere you can point to on a map. Conflicts over resources, intractable border conflicts that are now exploding right, left, and center, whether it's on the India-China border, whether it's the Israelis and the Palestinians, whether it's the Yemenis. These will become more and more frequent as populations grow and as resources dwindle.
Yeah.
So we all have an interest in contributing to bandaging those wounds at the very least, and hopefully doing more.
Yeah, absolutely. It seems like the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You mentioned a few conflicts around the world and crises. We have, earthquakes in Morocco and floods in Libya, and we have Bangladesh, Burma, Myanmar borders still with Rohingya. But you did mention Israel-Palestine, and wanted to touch on that real quick. Just wanted to get your thoughts on maybe the role that humanitarian aid does and could play in that conflict, and bearing in mind that there is some objections being raised to the humanitarian agencies being used in place of diplomats very often. So without going that far, perhaps, is there a way that humanitarian aid could help, given that the Israel-Gaza conflict just blew up a few days ago and there's a lot of suffering coming out of there?
I mean, the Israeli Magen David, which is the Israeli version of the Red Cross, Red Crescent Society, and the Red Crescent Society in the Palestinian territories, are both active. So I'm sure they're doing work as we speak, dealing with people crawling out of the rubble in Gaza, or the wounded and the bereft families of people massacred in Israel this past week. I think talking about humanitarianism serving as a contributor to perhaps lessening tensions or building bridges between Israel and Palestine today, given the inflamed passions that this Hamas attack has brought forth, it's way too early to talk about that. I can't imagine that happening anytime soon. But it's not, there are certainly instances around the world of really, really deep divisions within countries and between neighboring countries being to a degree not remedied, but sharing humanitarian aid and I'm not expressing this well. We'll have to redo this.
Difficult question.
It's a super difficult question.
This is just one of those impossible questions because you can't have the international humanitarian agencies replacing the governments, replacing the diplomats, replacing the real serious peace discussions. And people want to just put a Band-Aid on it and send some hygiene kits down from the pipeline.
That's the easy
and say,
way.
we did our job.
Something. Yeah.
And it's
absolutely.
but at the same time, I see in this work we do, people crying all the time when they get $50 in cash or a box of hygiene items. It means a lot.
Yeah.
And there just seems like a lot of potential for peacemaking in humanitarian aid, while acknowledging also that it can be just a Band-Aid to cover much deeper problems.
Well, I'll give you an example. It's not necessarily related to humanitarian aid, but it had to do with developmental aid. I worked for a brief while for a small NGO that a friend of mine had created, and we worked along the Armenian Turkish border. And the goal was to try and link municipalities on both sides to one another so they could talk about issues of common concern. Cross-border crime, landfills, shared infrastructure, bridges, waterways, and so on, as a prelude to perhaps having deeper and more important conversations about those national relationships. You could imagine things like that happening in other places, and Israel-Palestine sounds like a really good example. But it can only happen in certain political climates, and those political climates can change overnight, and those opportunities can vanish. And to be honest, I don't think the humanitarian sector is really particularly politically savvy. And so we become kind of the beasts of burden, bringing in stuff and meeting immediate needs, but without particularly sophisticated understanding of the political dynamics, the ethnic dynamics, the religious dynamics, and so on of the places where we work. And again, that leads us back to the earlier conversation about localization and why it's so important that those people not just have a seat at the table, but have one of the most prominent seats at the table. Yeah.
That reminds me of something we touched briefly on, but we'll get to that later.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, Chris, I appreciate your time. We've gone on for a bit. I could talk to you forever on these things, but we won't tire out our audience. Maybe two more questions.
Sure.
First one, on the present situation in Ukraine. How are things going with the war, with the civilian population? Any thoughts you'd like to share on how things are in Ukraine right now?
Well, I think from a humanitarian perspective, things are not bad, as we talked about earlier. People's basic needs are met. Obviously, there are people who have lost their homes, their livelihoods, their possessions, but nobody's starving to death in Ukraine today. And that's a credit to a lot of actors. Having said that, the much anticipated winter offensive, or the rather summer offensive, hasn't yielded much in gains for the Ukrainians. And as winter sets in, probably the lines are going to harden. So we're left with a situation where the Russians still hold about 18% of Ukrainian territory, and that is something that most Ukrainians are not willing to accept. It seems to me like, barring a miracle, we're looking at least a couple more years of war. because politically, I think it's next to impossible for any Ukrainian leader to suggest trading territory for peace. That may change as more people are killed and wounded in Ukraine. But right now, that's the fact. I think the thing that worries me a lot, of course, is will the Western powers stand with Ukraine? There seems to continue to be an alliance between the senior Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Senate to continue aid, despite the setbacks of late. There's talk about doing one big, enormous Ukraine defense bill of $50 billion, I think they're talking about, and to stop having these endless spats over smaller tranches of money. That would be a good thing, because the U.S. is important in two levels. One is we're important simply because we're providing the lion's share of the military assistance, although overall the European Union is providing more money than we are. But secondly, because if we stand aside, then others will find excuses to do the same. So we either lead by example or we don't lead. But, Ukrainians are tough people, and, they are fighting for something that's worth fighting for, their land and their homes and their loved ones. So I don't see them raising the white flag ever. But what this war looks like a year or two from now, I can only speculate.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, one last question, a bit more fun.
Yeah.
Any personal heroes or people you look up to, dead or alive, in this crazy world?
Well, I was thinking about this when you suggested that might be one of the questions, and I was sort of struggling. But then it came to me that there was a guy I met in 1994 on the border with Rwanda in Burundi. And this was just when the Rwandan genocide had kicked off. Nobody quite knew how horrible it was going to be. And as we know, at the end of the day, at least 800,000 people lost their lives in that genocide. But it was clear something was going badly wrong in Rwanda, because I was in Burundi and I was seeing refugees cross the border in great numbers, and a lot of them with terrible machete wounds on their bodies and so on. So I decided to go up to the border and see what I could find out. So I'm standing there at the border, and I can see over to the Rwandan side there were people's huts burning. Down in the river below us, the Akagera River, there were bodies floating down that river, often with the hands tied behind their backs. And there was one other guy who was obviously a foreigner standing at that border about 20 feet from me. And he was sort of a Mediterranean-looking guy with a big bushy black beard, and seemed to feel very comfortable. He was chatting with some Burundians in Kirundi, the local language. So I was impressed by that to start with. So I wandered over and introduced myself. He turned out to be a Bosnian Franciscan friar who had been working in Rwanda for 8 years and had picked up Kinyarwanda, which is the language of Rwanda, very similar to Kirundi and Burundi. And by himself, he was simply crossing that border, buying things, throwing them in the back of his pickup truck, and delivering them to the people who were displaced by the terrible violence that was going on in Rwanda. He didn't have any international donors, didn't have any fleet of trucks. He just was doing what he could. And anyway, so we made contact. We became friends. I managed to get him plugged into some large aid networks out of Burundi with the World Food Program, the UN's big food delivery arm, with my colleagues in Catholic Relief Services. And through him and his network, we were able to distribute assistance to hundreds of thousands of people in Burundi. And largely because he always insisted upon accompanying the convoys of relief trucks. and sitting right in the front vehicle and talking our way through scores, I do not exaggerate, scores of checkpoints manned by crazy people waving machetes and hand grenades in our direction, often drunk and drugged. These were the militias that were responsible for carrying out the massacres. But through his linguistic prowess, his ability to speak Kinyarwanda, his sense of humor, his just general kind of good guy demeanor, he was able to get us through some really dodgy situations and get stuff where it needed to go. And he was an odd guy. I asked him about his family one time. He said, we're two brothers. One went into the priesthood, him, and he said, my brother went in the army. I said, what does your brother do? He says he's a Bosnian sniper. He's killing Serbs as we speak. But, well, there's a family story that needs to be told at some point. Anyway, this guy was just one of the most courageous and selfless guys I've ever met, but always retained a great sense of humor. Was just a fun guy to be around. He was always ready to drink a beer or eat a big plate of stew. The horrible environment he was operating on just didn't seem to affect him in any profound way. Sadly, after the war, he was assassinated by somebody for unknown reasons. I think he perhaps pointed the finger at some massacres that were happening after the war by the victorious Rwandan troops. And people didn't like the fact that this person that was supposed to just deliver humanitarian aid also might have opinions on human rights and so on. So somebody put a bullet in his head. And he was only, I don't know, maybe 40 years old at that point. But he's a hero. Yeah.
Good choice.
Thank you.
What was his name?
Vieko Čurić.
Vieko Čurić.
Yeah.
Bringing the love back to humanitarian work.
He's a good man.
Well, Chris, thank you so much. I've been Abe Collier, host of the Voluntarian podcast. This is Chris Hennemeyer, longtime humanitarian and volunteer now in Ukraine.
A pleasure, my friend.
Appreciate your time.
Cheers.